Professor Zethar's advanced xenobiology class was renowned throughout the Galactic University for its rigorous examination of fear responses across species. The massive cron, standing nearly 3 meters tall with obsidian scales and razor-sharp claws, took particular pride in his practical demonstrations. Today's lesson would focus on predator-prey dynamics, and he had selected 2 volunteers from his diverse class of 43 students. Alvina, a delicate sulfian with iridescent wings and compound eyes that could detect movement across 17 different light spectrums, trembled slightly as she took her position at the front of the lecture hall. Her species had evolved as prey animals on a world teeming with apex predators, and every fiber of her being screamed warnings as she faced the assembled class. Beside her stood Rafi, the only human in the cohort. He appeared remarkably unremarkable compared to his alien classmates. Average height, brown hair, wearing simple clothes that seemed almost primitive next to the biosuits and energy garments of other species. He carried a battered notebook and what appeared to be an ancient writing instrument called a pen. "Observe carefully," Professor Zethar announced, his voice a low rumble that resonated through the amphitheater's bioacoustic walls. "I will now activate my species' natural hunting display. Note the physiological responses of our volunteers." The cron's transformation was terrifying. His scales darkened to absolute black, absorbing light like a void. His claws extended with metallic scrapes that echoed through the chamber. Most disturbing of all, his bioluminescent throat sac began pulsing with hypnotic patterns designed to paralyze prey through neurological overload. The effect on the class was immediate. Students from dozens of worlds recoiled, their various fight-or-flight responses triggering simultaneously. The Centauran delegation's fur stood on end. The crystalline Voxian's mineral bodies rang with harmonic stress frequencies. Several aquatic species released defensive ink clouds into their environmental suits. Alvina's reaction was perhaps the most dramatic. Her wings buzzed frantically as ancient genetic programming flooded her system with terror. Her compound eyes dilated fully, scanning for escape routes while her respiratory system shifted into crisis mode. She managed to remain standing, but barely, her entire frame shaking with the effort of resisting the urge to flee. Professor Zethar's hunting display reached its crescendo. The patterns on his throat sac accelerated, and he released a subsonic growl that activated the deepest fear centers of virtually every known sapient species. The sound was designed by millions of years of evolution to trigger absolute submission in prey. Every eye in the lecture hall turned to observe the human's response. Rafi yawned. It wasn't a small, polite yawn. It was the kind of deep, jaw-cracking yawn that suggested he might have stayed up too late studying. He covered his mouth with his hand, apparently a social courtesy among his species, and then, incredibly, he flipped open his notebook and began writing. The scratching of his primitive pen was audible in the stunned silence that followed. Professor Zethar's display faltered. In his 3 centuries of teaching, he had never encountered a prey response quite like this. His bioluminescent patterns flickered uncertainly as he tried to process what he was witnessing. "Fascinating," Rafi muttered, glancing up at the professor while continuing to scribble notes. "The subsonic frequency appears to be targeting the amygdala analogs in most species. I'm assuming that throat sac has some kind of resonance chamber. The pattern frequency is approximately 12.7 Hz, if my count is correct." The human looked around at his terrified classmates with what appeared to be mild curiosity rather than fear. "Oh, should I be scared? Sorry, Professor. I was too busy analyzing the mechanism. Could you do that again? I want to time the pattern cycle." Several students in the back rows fainted. Alvina stared at Rafi in amazement. How was he not only unaffected but actually taking notes? Her terror began to mix with fascination as she watched him study their professor with the detached interest of a researcher rather than the panic of prey. Professor Zethar slowly deactivated his hunting display, his scales returning to their normal deep green. "Mr. Rafi," he said carefully, "are you perhaps experiencing some form of neurological malfunction? My display is calibrated to trigger fear responses in all known sapient species." Rafi looked up from his notebook, pen poised thoughtfully. "Oh no, I can see why it would be scary. The visual display is quite impressive, and that sound probably hits right at the frequency that most species evolved to recognize as a large predator. It's just that humans didn't really have that many natural predators. He flipped back a few pages in his notebook. See, most of our evolutionary pressure came from other humans, environmental challenges, persistence hunting, and tool use. We're actually the predators in most of our ecosystems back on Earth. So when I see a threat display like yours, my brain doesn't think run away. It thinks, how does this work, and how would I counter it? The lecture hall was completely silent except for the sound of Alvina's gradually slowing wing beats as she calmed down. In fact, Rafi continued, warming to his topic, I was thinking that if I encountered a cron in actual combat, the subsonic frequency could probably be disrupted with a simple sonic dampener. The visual pattern is more complex, but if you could introduce a counter pattern or just flash a bright light at the right moment. Professor Zethar held up one massive claw. Mr. Rafi, are you taking notes on how to defeat my species in combat? Rafi blinked, then looked down at his notebook as if seeing it for the first time. Oh yeah, I guess I am. Sorry. Is that inappropriate? It's just instinct. Humans tend to analyze threats and figure out solutions. It's kind of what we do. The professor stared at this unremarkable-looking creature who had just casually dissected millions of years of evolutionary advantage while yawning. Around the lecture hall, 42 other students were beginning to look at their human classmate with a mixture of awe and terror that had nothing to do with Professor Zethar's display. Class dismissed. The professor announced quietly, I need to reconsider my lesson plan. As students filed out, chattering excitedly in dozens of languages, Alvina approached Rafi. How? She asked simply. Rafi shrugged, closing his notebook. I guess when your species spends a few 100,000 years as persistence hunters who chase prey until it dies of exhaustion, you develop a different relationship with fear. We're kind of the thing that other things should be scared of. He smiled. A distinctly human expression that somehow managed to be both friendly and unsettling.